Hey everyone, as you might have heard, BattleTech has a new line of core products that are being released in August 2026. The goal, I think, is to make it easier for people interested in the game to get started and to understand which products will guide them along from just learning the game to playing the game in full with all of the rules. But even with this release, you might still have some questions. So in this video, I'm going to give you a quick overview of how the game of BattleTech is played, what the game flow is like, what materials you need to play, and a few things that will be changing with the core release. This is going to be very, very rules light. I am not teaching the game in this first video, just hopefully giving you a sense of what it's like to play. In the next video, I'll start getting into the rules for initiative and movement. I'll explain what that means in a minute. Again, I'll be looking at some of the changes that are coming with the core release, and then I'll just keep going from there. So with that said, this is obviously aimed at beginners and people who are thinking about getting into the game. But those of you that have been playing for a while might still get a little bit of insight into some of the tweaks that they're making with the rules. All right, so what is BattleTech? It's not really the easiest question to answer, but the best way I can think to describe it is a complex board game that attempts to simulate combat between heavily armed forces. And the primary unit that represents this type of combat, the star of the show, some might say, is a walking tank called a battle mech. So these are what you're going to see on the box. These are the thing that everybody wants to use in their game. They're a very big part of the game of BattleTech. Now, I call it a board game, and that might be a little bit too simplistic because it is a war game as well. I mean, you can see right here in my initial setup, I mean, I've got miniatures that are on a map. You can have terrain on this map. So it does play a little bit like a war game. It also plays a little bit like an RPG. Your units have their own sheet, their own record sheets that have all this information on them. What's their skill level? How much can they move? What weapons do they have available to them? What kind of armor do they have? All this stuff is on the sheet, but it kind of works in reverse because the units start off really strong and then slowly degrade over the course of the game and get less and less effective. But it does play a little bit like an RPG. Each of these units plays like they're a character almost. And in practice, what this game really does is tell a story. That's the crux of it. It's a beer and pretzels game. A lot of people say that. Basically just means you're just here to have a good time. But the game tells a story using the randomness of dice rolls. There are a lot of dice rolls in this game, and the general craziness of these random rolls is what makes the game so much fun. So I mentioned your forces are going to degrade. You'll have things like losing your equipment, losing weapons, losing their limbs, having an arm or a leg fall off, taking engine hits, overheating these battle mechs to the point of detonating their own ammo, falling. They might fall on their face, fall on their back. They might have their pilot knocked unconscious. Or you might even have a point in the game where a mech that can barely walk gets a heroic headshot to win a mission. And sometimes all of this destruction happens, there's no clear winner, and everyone just realizes how much war sucks. There are a lot of different ways that this game can go, thanks to these two things. Now, I did mention that the game is complex, and this is mostly true. When you look at the rule book, there's a lot going on. But honestly, the base game that I'm going to show in these videos is not that difficult. There are just a lot of edge cases that can make the rules seem overwhelming because it does try to simulate what combat would be like between these types of units. So they're walking, right? They have legs, they walk. Okay, that means they can fall. So you got to have rules for falling. They're huge, and some of them have hands. So that means they can pick things up. So you got rules for picking things up. You got rules for hitting other mechs and other units with the thing that you're holding in your hand. You know, those types of things come up that do make the game a little bit complex, but the basics of playing the game really aren't that bad. And just to see if I can prove this to you, I went ahead and cleaned things up and set up a really basic scenario just to show you the flow of the game. And then you can make your own decision on whether the basic game is as simple as I'm making it out to be. So BattleTech operates in rounds, and every round has 6 phases to it. So I'm going to walk you through each of those 6 phases and explain generally what happens during them. At the start of a game, there will be some decision made about how the units will deploy. So you and your opponent are going to have some number of units, and if you're playing a specific mission, it might tell you you can deploy your units anywhere on the map, or you're going to choose a home side, and then your opponent has a home side, and you can deploy your units somewhere near your home. Or maybe you just walk your units onto the map. Or maybe you're playing some sort of a set piece where there's very specific places on the map that your units can go. Whatever the decision is, you will deploy your units, and then you'll get started. And the very first phase of every round is called initiative. And initiative determines which side will have the opportunity to see what their opponent does before they have to act. And the initiative phase is very, very simple. Each side has their own set of 2 6-sided dice. You roll them, and whoever has the higher number wins initiative. And that player will get to act later in the round anytime it calls for alternating decisions. So in this case, I'm just going to roll these both up, and we'll see who gets the higher number. All right, the blue side got 8, the black side got 4, so the blue side wins initiative. Anytime we're alternating turns, the blue side will get to go later in that phase. Now in our simple example here, and maybe I should put this one actually on a hex, each side only has 2 units. So anytime the game is asking for us to alternate turns, it's really simple. The black side will move 1 unit, then the blue side will move 1 unit. The black side will move their other unit, and then the blue side will move their last unit. That's it. But that's the second phase after initiative. It's called the movement phase. And that's when the players are going to take turns positioning their units on the battlefield or just holding their position if that's what they choose to do. And the way this works is that each unit has its own set of movement points it can use to enter hexes or to change their facing on a hex side. So you'll see here I am using a map that has hexes printed on it. And this is the method. You can think of these as board game spaces, if you will. And this is what all the units will use to determine which way they're facing and just generally how they're moving. Now, the basics of how this works is that the unit will choose what type of movement mode it's going to use. So most units are going to have a walking or cruising speed, which is kind of their slower speed, a running or flanking speed, which is their fast speed, and some units that are equipped with jump jets can use jumping movement. Now, there's pros and cons to each of these. So the slower you move, the easier it is for you to attack. So you're going to have less of a penalty when you try to attack something. The faster you move, or when you're jumping, which is the most flexible type of movement, it will be harder for you to attack. So you're going to have a higher modifier when you go to attack something. The only way you can move backwards is if you use the walking or cruising speed. So if I were to choose this Warhammer here and I say I want to use walking movement, I could choose to move forward or backward with that movement. Every hex that you enter, regardless of your movement mode, costs at least 1 movement point to enter. So this Warhammer here has a 4 for its walking speed and a 6 for its running speed. So because all of these hexes are clear, there's nothing in them, it would simply cost them 1 movement point to move into this hex. That would be 1, 2, 3, 4. And under walking movement speed, it would have to stop there. It would not have any other movement left. However, it could walk in different ways. It could walk this way for 1 movement point, and then it could decide to change its facing. So it could turn. Each hex side that the unit turns costs 1 movement point. So that would be its second movement point, and then it can continue from there, 3, 4. Now each unit can make themselves harder to hit by moving more hexes. And that's the total number of hexes moved, not the number of movement points that are spent. So in this example, we started here, so the Warhammer moved 1, 2, 3 hexes. That will give them a target movement modifier when we get into combat of 1. So you can just try to remember that, or a much better method that the rulebook will recommend is to use dice to mark this. So anytime a unit uses walking movement, you're going to mark it with a white dice, and you're going to show the target movement modifier on the top. So in this case, I would mark it with a 1. If the unit moves only 2 hexes, for example, they would not get a target movement modifier. You would just mark that with a 6, just to indicate it doesn't have a modifier. And that's generally because most units can't generate a 6. There are some that could, but most cannot, especially with mechs. So you can mark it with a 6 and everybody will know that means 0. If you use running movement, you'll mark them with a black dice. And if you use jumping movement, you'll mark them with a red dice. That's what the rulebook recommends. You're free to come up with whatever method you want, but generally it's a good idea to mark your units with a dice just to make everything easier later on, so you don't have to go back multiple phases to figure out what the heck did this unit do. As you might imagine, the terrain that is in the hex can modify how many movement points are required to get through it. So let's imagine that this unit is going to choose walking movement as well. It will get 6 movement points for that. This is a lighter unit. You can see it's just kind of small and fast. So it gets more movement points when it chooses to walk. Now to walk into this first hex is only going to cost 1 movement point because it's clear. But to walk into this hex with the depth 1 water, it gets more complicated. And I'm not going to get into all the modifiers here. I'll save that for the next video. But to go down a level would cost an extra movement point. And to walk into water would also cost an extra movement point. In addition, we have to check the piloting skill on this unit when it walks into water, just because that's difficult terrain to navigate. Let's just say we'll forget about the piloting thing right now. So it's going to cost it 3 movement points to get into here. So we're already down to 2 left. Then it wants to get back up here, but it has to go back up a level. So that's going to cost it 1 to get into the hex and a +1 to go up the level. That's going to cost 2 more to get out of there. And that would be all of its movement. So if it chose to do that, again, it moved 3 hexes, 1, 2, 3, and it would go here and we would mark it again with a white dice with a 1. However, this unit has another option available to it. It can jump. And when a unit can jump, it can move across any type of terrain without paying those penalties. So this unit can actually jump 6 total hexes. It could jump over this water, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and it could land right here. When it does that, it can choose any facing when it lands. It doesn't have to pay any movement points for that. It can also land in the woods. That's no problem. It can also land on top of the hill as long as the level on the hill isn't higher than its jump rating. So if this said level 7, it would not be able to jump on there. But because it's only level 1, that's no problem. It can jump right on top of that hill. It doesn't pay any of the penalties to do that. If we tried to walk or run up there, it would take way more movement points. We only use 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You always calculate how far it moved by the shortest path. So you can't, you're not doing stuff like this. But that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hexes. When you move 5 hexes, you typically get a 2 for the target movement modifier. But when you jump, you get an extra +1. So that's going to bump it to a 3. So I would mark this unit with a red dice with a 3 on it. At this point, the black side would go again. We're going to move this Griffin here. The Griffin also has jump jets. It wants to get up here into these heavy woods, so it's just going to go ahead and use its jump movement to get into there. The woods will provide a unit with protection, so it'll be harder to hit it when it's sitting in the woods. Sometimes it can be beneficial to get into there. However, it does slow your movement down. So this only moved 2 hexes, which would normally be a 0, but because it jumped, it's going to get an extra +1 on that, so it's going to get a 1 target movement modifier. By the way, this Griffin normally has a 5 walk, an 8 running, and a 5 jump movement profile. So finally would be the Battle Master here. This is a pretty iconic mech here, pretty huge, tons of weapons. It has a 4 walk and a 6 run movement profile as well. It cannot jump, so it's just going to go, it's going to choose running movement, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 hexes moved. I will mark it with a black dice with a 1 on it because it moved 4 total hexes, and that will be the end of our movement phase. Let me call out here that when we were talking about the Javelin crossing this depth 1 water hex, this is an area where things are going to change in the core products that are coming out. There will be reduced penalties for moving through water. There also will not be a piloting skill check when you walk into water, so that's kind of why I skipped that there. And they're going to make running possible in water. But they're generally going to be more friendly to units moving in water. So just wanted to call that out there. As you can see, trying to walk through there was really difficult. Use a lot of movement, and it also runs the risk that you could fall into there. And when you fall in water, other bad things can happen. But the core rulebook is going to make that more friendly, a little bit easier to move through that. All right, next comes the fun part. So we're done with the movement phase because all the units have moved. We're going to get into the weapon attack phase. Now, in the new core rules, when these new core products come out, this phase is going to be changed to the ranged attack phase. It's not going to be called the weapon attack phase anymore. They're calling it the ranged attack phase. I guess that's because you're using only ranged weapons in this phase, which kind of makes sense. But you might find people who are saying, what's the ranged attack phase? Because they still think it's weapon attack. In any case, at this point, the players are going to take turns declaring their weapon attacks, or soon to be called the ranged attacks. And that's going to be based on their unit's equipment, their firing arcs, their range, and any heat that they might have built up. And we haven't talked about heat yet, but as these units fire these big energy weapons and these missiles and other things that they carry, they can build up heat, and that can affect them on later rounds in terms of how easy or hard it is to hit something else. Now, just like with movement, these units are going to use initiative order to declare their weapon or ranged attacks. So they're going to alternate. So the black side would choose 1 unit and they declare an attack. Then the blue side will declare an attack. Then the black side declares their last attack. And then the blue side declares their last attack. And once they do that, you can resolve those attacks in any order. But the players have to go through with each attack that they declared, even if the unit that they were targeting has been destroyed. Now, if you've played Alpha Strike before, if you're coming from Alpha Strike and curious about classic BattleTech, this is different. In Alpha Strike, you have a specific order that the players resolve their attacks. So generally the side that lost initiative is going to go through all of their attacks first. And if a unit is destroyed in the process, they can then choose a different unit to target. So you can take advantage of focus firing on a unit and then moving on to something else. Well, that's not the case in Classic BattleTech. If that unit is destroyed, your attack is wasted because that unit is already gone. So in other words, if you used ammunition, if you fired missiles, but that unit was already destroyed, you're still firing those missiles and you're losing that ammunition. The only exception to this rule is if an attack would be impossible. So if you declare your attacks, but when you go to calculate the number, it's a 13 or higher, you're allowed to abort that attack. But that's the only circumstance where you don't have to go through with that. You have to think about what you're going to do. Do you want to take both units and focus fire on something, running the risk that one of those units might waste their turn because the other unit was already destroyed? Or do you want to spread it out just in case, but then potentially you don't end up destroying that unit and now you wish you would have? Those are the decisions you have to make when you're playing Classic BattleTech. So in terms of how the weapons declaration works or the range attack declarations work, we could say, all right, the Warhammer is going to fire 2 PPCs at the Battlemaster. Then the Battlemaster says, okay, I'm going to fire 1 PPC at the Warhammer. The Griffin says, I'm going to fire an LRM-10 at this Javelin. And the Javelin says, I don't even know if I have anything in range. Ooh, just barely. Okay, I'm going to try to attack this Griffin with my 2 SRM-6s. And you don't need to know anything about the weapons I'm talking about right now, just giving you an example of how it would go. So it declares those weapons, it would look at its sheet to see what kind of weapons it has, and then it would make those declarations. Once all the declarations are done, like I said, you can go ahead and start resolving those in any order that you like. Now, if some of these units end up hitting, the damage that they inflict during this phase, the weapon attack phase, does not actually take effect until the next phase. So all the declared attacks can and must be completed. In other words, like this Battlemaster here, which has a PPC on its arm, if it gets that arm blown off during this phase, it can still complete its attack with the PPC on the Warhammer. So it's not like the damage that you do is impacting your ability to attack during this phase. That's the same as Alpha Strike. So if you destroy a unit in Alpha Strike, that unit still gets a turn to attack this phase. Then it's destroyed. The same goes in Classic BattleTech. If it destroys this arm, the arm is destroyed at the end of this phase, but during this phase, it can continue making an attack with it and complete all the declared attacks. So to that point, after all the weapon attacks are completed by both players, the damage effects are applied. So in this example, that Battlemaster would lose its right arm and it would not be able to use it for the rest of the game. The players will make any necessary rolls to prevent their units from falling or whatever else happens in here, and then they'll move on to the next phase. The next phase is called the physical attack phase. And so in this phase, players will again take turns declaring their physical attacks, if any are possible. And in this example that we have right here, there are no physical attacks possible. And that's because the units typically need to be in adjacent hexes to perform physical attacks. So let's just say if we change it up here, there would be the potential for both of these units to engage in physical attacks. And there are multiple types of physical attacks. The two most common are going to be punching and kicking. So I'm just going to kind of stick with that for right now. So for example, this Battlemaster could try to kick the Warhammer. And one thing that's really important to note is that units can make weapon attacks or ranged attacks and also make physical attacks. So for example, this Battlemaster could fire 3 medium lasers at this Warhammer, and then it can also try to kick it. Now that's different from Alpha Strike, where you have to choose between using weapon attacks or using physical attacks. So in Classic BattleTech, as long as you don't use the arm or the leg that you're trying to use in the physical attack phase, you can also make a physical attack. So for example, let's say this Battlemaster fired a medium laser or something from this left arm. Well, it can't punch with that left arm then in the physical attack phase. But as long as it didn't do that, it can make plenty of weapon or ranged attacks in the previous phase, and then in this phase, it can continue on with the physical attack. Just like before, these attacks are resolved in any order after they've been declared. The target can't change if the original target is destroyed in the process, or if you don't think that attack is worth it anymore. That's too bad. Once you declare the attack, you have to go through with it. Any damage that's inflicted will not take effect until the next phase. So again, if a mech has its arm destroyed in this phase, it can still use that arm to punch in the same phase. And going back to our previous example, if this mech, the Battlemaster, had this arm blown off during the weapon attack phase or the ranged attack phase, it won't be able to use that arm here in the physical attack phase. And then after all the physical attacks are complete, the damage effects are applied, and again, the players make any necessary rolls that they need to for their units or pilots. All right, so that's 4 out of the 6 phases. After all that, the major stuff is done. We go into the heat phase. So after all the attacks are done, the players are going to track their heat buildup, and that's just for mechs. Mechs are the only types of units on the ground that will track heat, so these are going to be the most common things that you're using, and they will track their heat. They will resolve their effects at that time, so there might be penalties to their movement. They might slow down because of heat. They might have penalties in the next round for their attacks, so they might have interference because of all the heat that's making it harder for them to attack. They might have to roll to prevent their unit from shutting down. So if they get too hot, the mech might try to shut down. They'll have to roll to override that. The same goes for ammo explosions. There's potential to cook off some of the ammo. You'll have to make a roll to avoid that. If you have the beginner box, which I'll talk about in a minute, the heat phase is not included in that. So there's no heat being tracked. You don't have to worry about this particular phase. Then we come to the end phase. And at this point, there's just a couple of little things to do. You're basically just kind of cleaning up and getting ready for the next round. You can roll to see if there's any unconscious pilots that end up regaining their consciousness. You can enable or disable any equipment that the unit has, or you can try to jettison ammunition. So if you're worried that something bad is going to happen to that ammunition, you can try to get rid of it. In that case, it doesn't happen until the next round, but you can at least start the process here in the end phase. When you get to the next round, if you get to the end phase and everything's still good, you will successfully get rid of that ammunition. Now, that rule is going to change in the upcoming core release. I think they're taking away the option to jettison ammo, but as of right now, under Total Warfare rules, you can still do that. Okay, at that point, you would reset. If there's any destroyed units, you'd remove them from the map, and then you'll go back to the initiative phase and you'll start all over. You'll roll for initiative, you'll see which side is going to get to act last, and then you'll proceed through the rest of the phases. Okay, and that's basically it. That's the flow of the game. Again, I'm not getting into a lot of detail, so if you're looking for exactly how to start playing, I'm not going to get into that much detail here. I'm just trying to tell you how to get started. But hopefully that gives you a decent overview of how the game works. Most of the complexity is going to come in the movement phase, where you're trying to figure out where you can move and how many movement points it takes, and the weapon attack phase, where you're just trying to figure out what weapons you can use and how much you need to roll in order to hit the target. All right, so at this point, let's take a quick step back and let's just talk about what do you need to play this game. I mean, obviously, I've got two things out here that you need. You've got a map with hexes on it, and right here I'm using a BattleTech neoprene map. This is an official map from Catalyst Game Labs. And this has a grasslands terrain on it. And the reason I wanted to use this is because it has most of the common terrain that you'll find in a game of BattleTech. It has woods, it has hills, and it has water. These are three really common things that you're going to see on maps. So I just wanted to use this one for demonstration purposes. You don't necessarily have to use maps as is, though. You can use tokens like this that come with some of the box sets, which I'll explain in a minute. And you can just place these directly onto the map. So you can just cover up hexes with that, and that changes the terrain. So you do have some options to try to customize what this map will look like. If you don't have neoprene maps, that's totally fine. Most of the BattleTech box sets come with paper maps. In fact, all of them do, the ones that are intended to get you started with the game. So you can use a paper map, it's completely fine. If you buy the beginner box, or what's about to be called the starter box, it does come with a really great starter map. It's just like a wide open terrain with just some woods in it. So it really lets you get used to playing the game without having to worry about too many different types of terrain. So that's a really good option. I don't know if the same map will be included in the new version of the beginner box, but it's fair to say it probably will. But in any case, there's tons of these paper maps. Like I said, they come in the box sets. You can also buy separate map packs that have them in there. Don't let anyone tell you that paper maps can't be used. They're great. I use them all the time. I do like the neoprene maps better when I can get them, but not everybody wants to pay 40 bucks for one map. So these paper maps are great. I've got a huge collection of them and I use them all the time. You can use hexless maps. That is a possibility. There's a separate set of rules called miniatures rules. I'm not going to cover those in my tutorial, but it is an option if you prefer to play that way, especially if you're coming from other war games where you do use physical line of sight. You might prefer to play that way, but just keep in mind that the core rules of BattleTech do not tell you how to do that. You would need to go find the separate miniature rules, which aren't hard to find, but you just would need to do that. You will, of course, need dice. And when I say dice, you need two 6-sided dice to play the game. Again, when we go back to initiative where I use two different sets of dice, you're free to just roll this 2 times. One player rolls it and then the other player rolls it. So at a bare minimum, you need 2 pairs of 6-sided dice. Now, I will tell you, if that's all you have, you're going to be rolling these a lot. There are a lot of rolls in this game, and if you just have 1 pair of dice, you're going to be making a lot of rolls. Like I mentioned before, you won't be able to mark your units if that's the case. It's going to be a lot harder to keep track of who moved and what's their modifiers and all that stuff. So I would personally suggest having several sets of dice in different colors to not only allow for tracking like this, but also to roll multiple things at the same time and keep track of them. So if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I always have a huge set of different colored dice available. Again, not everybody wants to pay for this, but I think it really does help to play the game. At a bare minimum, if possible, you will want to have white, black, and red dice available just for the sake of marking the units on the map, just because that saves so much time. And this is a game that can take a lot of time. So if you have shortcuts like that, it really does help a lot. Another thing you'll need are record sheets. So these are going to keep track of your units. They're going to show their armor, their internal structure, what components they have, their ranges and heat amounts for their weapons, tracking the pilot, tracking their heat. And these are included in, again, all the box sets that are meant to get you started. They're going to have some record sheets in there. You can also go to the BattleTech downloads page, which I'll put in the description of the video, and you can download all the record sheets they have from there as well. So whether you get the units or the miniatures from a box set, or you get them from one of the force packs that they sell, you can find almost all of the record sheets. There are other useful resources as well, like Mortal, where you can just type in a unit and print out the record sheet from there. But generally, Catalyst does make it pretty easy to find the record sheets. Now, mechs, which is what I've been using in my tutorials so far, they use full-page record sheets. And again, they track all this different information on here, from the unit itself to the pilot that's running it. If you get the beginner box, the mechs will use half sheets. So they're only going to track their equipment and their armor. You're not going to have internal structure. You're not going to have critical slots. You're not going to have heat. So they'll be very simplified. So you'll notice that if you were to get the beginner box, you wouldn't get these full sheets. You'll have some half sheets. Now, you can play with units other than mechs. So for example, you might play with some combat vehicles. I got one unpainted one here, but VTOLs, or helicopters, if you will, and tanks, they're considered combat vehicles, and you can play with them. Now, they use half sheets as well, but they're much more detailed. So they will track their armor, their internal structure, what weapons they have, and they'll also track things about the crew that's piloting it and any damage that's happened to, like, the motive system. So if they have treads or they have wheels, it's going to track any damage that might have occurred to those. You can also play with infantry. These have very different record sheets from vehicles and mechs. They basically track the number of troopers that are in the squad and the maximum amount of damage that they can do and their skill level. So there's different record sheets for those. I'm not really going to cover them right now. I will have a video where I talk about those. However, the new core rulebook is going to introduce a completely alternative system called battlefield support. Now, this has been around for a while, but they are going to make it officially part of the core rules. And that does something completely different. So instead of using the half sheets for vehicles and the special infantry sheets for the squads, you're going to use a simplified card system instead. And they'll look like this. So if you played Alpha Strike, it looks really similar to an Alpha Strike card. And so these are just going to give them basic movement and combat stats that you'll see at the bottom here. They don't track any specific details about them, and they just make a roll in the end phase to see if they're destroyed or not. So you just keep track of how much damage they've taken. If they hit that number or higher, you just make a roll at the end on this check. And if you hit it, it's destroyed. If you don't, that number goes down by 1 and the next check will be easier. But that's basically it. So you're not doing detailed tracking like you do for mechs and as you've done for combat vehicles and infantry under the current set of core rules. Obviously, you're going to need something to represent the units. So you can use the official miniatures that come with the box sets or the force packs. Those are probably preferred because most people want to see these things on the map. You're under no obligation to paint them, though. You don't have to do that kind of thing. Nobody really cares. Like, the company doesn't care if you play with unpainted miniatures. I mean, most people probably like when they're painted, but you know, you're under no obligation to do that. You can use unofficial miniatures if you want. You can use cardboard standees, which come in some of the box sets, or you can just even use proxies. Like, you could just put coins on here or paper clips. That's what they mentioned in the rule book. And as long as you know which direction it's facing, you're good to go to use that. BattleTech is very, very friendly about the materials that you can use during a game. You can just play on the map like it is right here with just the printed terrain, and you just keep track of exactly where things are. You can use 3D terrain if you want. I've done that in my videos. You're free to do that. A lot of people like 3D terrain, but I'll tell you what, when you don't play with 3D terrain, it's really easy to set up and start a game of BattleTech. Last thing you're going to need, a pencil. You need a pencil to mark your record sheets. If you are playing with battlefield support and those cards that I showed you, you probably want to have a dry erase marker just to mark these things. That would probably be useful. But generally, if you're just playing with mechs, you're just going to need a pencil, maybe an eraser. And like I said, optionally, you might want something like this just to draw nice lines on the map so you can see what has line of sight to each other. Now, after seeing the game flow and seeing the materials that you need, you're probably asking yourself the most common question I ever see asked about BattleTech by newer players: which product should I buy to get started? It's a very good question, and they haven't really made it super easy to know what to get so far. If you're planning to get into the game right now, and this is April 2026, so before this new core release is happening, this box right here, A Game of Armored Combat, is what 95% of players should get. It has a great name. That's going away, unfortunately, but this is a great name for a box. But it also has literally everything you need to play a full game with 2 players. The only thing it doesn't have is this, no pencil. But other than that, you get everything in here. It comes with 8, I would say, iconic mechs. It has the Battlemaster in there. It has the Catapult. It has the Commando. These are mechs that I think about from back in the MechWarrior 2 days, how I was introduced to BattleTech. It has a bunch of paper maps to play on. It has record sheets for the mechs that are in the box. It has scenarios for you to try. It has a primer on the universe and a short story if you're into that sort of thing, if you like the lore. It's got the rule book. It's not the full rules. It's kind of a somewhat streamlined set of rules, but it is basically all of the rules you need to play with mechs. And it even comes with a pair of dice, which again, you'll use a lot if that's all you're using. And it's about $70. You can find it some places for even cheaper than that, like maybe $60 or something. It's really a great price. And this is one of the best things about BattleTech is it doesn't cost a whole lot of money to get in here. And honestly, you could play dozens of games just from this box. And there are free downloads on the BattleTech website to do even more. Like you can play through a campaign just with what you have inside of here. So unless you already know you love this game and this universe and you're ready to start building a collection, you really don't need to buy anything else. You don't have to buy a bunch of paint. You don't have to do that kind of stuff in BattleTech. So it really is newbie friendly. Now, if you're not certain that you like the game and you just want to give it a try without investing too much, or if you feel like this full game sounds a little bit too complicated, the beginner box that I've mentioned a couple of times is an option. It comes with 2 mechs, 1 map, and very simplified rules and record sheets. So this will give you a feel for what it's like to play, and then you can decide if you want to get the full box from there, or you can just buy it for the mechs because they usually have at least 1 unique mech in that box. So oftentimes people will buy that box because it's the only way that they can get that particular miniature. Now, I mentioned this a few times, but in August 2026, the 2 boxes I'm talking about will be refreshed and renamed to make it easier to know which to buy. In other words, you'd hopefully not need someone like me to explain it to you. A Game of Armored Combat box will become the core box, and the beginner box will become the starter box. Both are going to have similar components in them to what I just described, but all the mech miniatures will be brand new, and the focus will be on the current era in BattleTech, which is called Ilclan. And on that note, there are a lot of eras in BattleTech that represent different time periods in the universe, as well as the real life development of the game. So it kind of started at one point in the timeline, and that timeline progressed each time they kind of refreshed the game and introduced new things to it. And this game's been around for 40 years, so there's quite a lot going on in terms of eras. But this concept can be kind of overwhelming to new players. But generally, you can think of it as the later the era, and obviously Ilclan is the latest, the more advanced and complicated the rules can be, especially when it comes to weapons and equipment, and the more explodey the game will play, for lack of a better term. Basically, things will get hit more often and likely get destroyed more quickly. Some people like playing that way, maybe some people don't. My advice is to just not worry too much about this sort of thing right now, or you'll drive yourself absolutely crazy. Just use whatever comes in the box you have to get started. The only thing I will offer on this topic is that if you've played the Harebrained Schemes BattleTech game or MechWarrior 5 Mercenaries, you will probably be more at home with the pre-core boxes because they use the Succession Wars era, which is used in those video games. And that era tends to be a little less explodey compared to what I just described. It's a little bit grittier. Everyone's trying to hang on to what they have. And so sometimes the battles go on, but they're not necessarily meant to just be total destruction of one side or the other. Sometimes both sides are just going to agree to give it up because it just doesn't make any sense to stick around and risk losing everything. So if you like that era, if you liked what you saw in the video games, you might want to stick with this box. All right, last thing. So I mentioned when I was giving the tutorial that at the start of the game, you might have a particular mission that you're playing, and the games can be played with a wide variety of objectives. You might just do a death match. The players just fight until one side has no units left, or until all their units are so badly damaged that they are no longer effective. You can do things like a base assault or a base defense, where one player tries to attack and destroy a base, and the other one tries to stop them from doing that. You can do recon missions, where a player tries to identify a building or some other important strategic objective and they try to escape, while the other player works to stop them or destroy them before they escape. You can do things like breakthrough or pursuit, where one player is trying to get from one side of the map to the other, and the other player is trying to get in their way, or they're chasing them from behind and trying to stop them from doing that. You can also participate in campaigns where you'll take part in a series of missions, or you can even do something like a mercenary campaign where you have a mercenary unit that persists in the universe. You're managing the forces outside of battle, the repairs, replacements, training your pilots. And in the case of mercenaries, you just might do that continuously. It never ends. You just keep taking on contracts and more missions, and you just play continuously like that, trying to build your mercenary company up from just a couple of new guys with tiny mechs to huge forces with assault mechs. The possibilities are limitless when it comes to that. And there are a lot of products that provide mission ideas with unique objectives and campaign systems, such as Total Warfare, which is the current core rulebook. It has a series of scenarios and built-in missions there. There's also the free Succession Wars Chaos campaign, which you can download from the BattleTech website. There's Campaign Operations, which is a full rulebook that explains how to build and run your own campaign. There's the Mercenaries box set, which has rules for a streamlined campaign in it. And there's also Hotspots Hinterlands, which builds off of that Mercenaries box and has a more fully fleshed out mercenary campaign. I know, that sounds like a lot, but welcome to BattleTech. There's lots of products. Now, the core rulebook, so that's another new thing that's coming out in addition to the 2 boxes I mentioned. That's going to include an entire section about missions with even more ideas. And from what I've heard, these mission ideas are really good. They're improved and they have a lot of balance mechanisms in them. So it sounds like they're going to be really great. So that core rulebook could be a place where you get even more mission ideas. And then you have products like BattleTech Aces, which have full narrative campaigns built into them. They have pre-built missions, a branching storybook, and Aces not only has the campaign built into it, but also has an automated opponent. So it's a deck of cards that will control units on the board. So if you want to play by yourself, or if you want to team up with a friend and go against an automated opponent, you can do that with this system. At the moment, however, they're only designed for Alpha Strike, which again is the more abstracted, simplified version of BattleTech. They say they're going to eventually support classic BattleTech, but I'm not sure how soon that will be. It sounds like it's kind of far off. Now, there are some people like me who have started adapting Aces to their own classic BattleTech games. You can check out my videos if you're interested in how that works. It's not perfect, but it can get the job done if you'd like to do that. There are a lot of game stores that'll have BattleTech nights or events or ongoing campaigns. If you're looking to find a group, you can check on Facebook, or you can ask a game store if you know one, if they have a Discord server, where I find that that's where people start talking about getting games going, or they announce when they're having events and things like that. So I think that's everything you know to get started. Like I said, my next videos are going to start on how to actually play through the different phases of the game. So we touched on them a little bit, but I'll show you specifically how you do movement, the different modifiers you might have to deal with when you're moving, how to make attacks, what happens when damage gets applied, what happens when you overheat. We'll get into all of that in the future videos. The next one I do will focus specifically on initiative. I'll go through that whole calculation of the unequal units and movement. And then I will, like I said, I'll take it from there. So I hope this helped. Let me know if you have any questions or if you have any other comments. And thanks a lot for watching.